The grand chandelier sparkled above the lavish dining hall, where wealthy guests laughed and sipped on expensive wine. It was a night of luxury, a gathering of power and privilege. But for Maria, the maid, it was just another evening of silent service, clearing plates, pouring drinks, and staying invisible. She had learned long ago that people like her were not meant to be noticed in houses like this. But tonight would be different. As she wiped down a table near the grand piano, Mr. Thornton, the wealthy host, smirked and snapped his fingers. "Maria," he called, his voice dripping with amusement, "you clean this piano every day. Tell me, do you even know how to play it?" The room fell silent. A few guests chuckled, sensing entertainment. Maria hesitated. She knew this wasn't a real question. It was a challenge, a joke at her expense. "Go on then," he said, leaning back. "Play something for us." She could hear the mockery in his voice, the expectation that she would embarrass herself. The other servants lowered their gazes, knowing better than to interfere. Maria stepped forward, heart pounding. She had never played in front of an audience like this. But as her fingers touched the keys, something changed. A melody filled the room, soft, powerful, breathtaking. And in that moment, the laughter stopped. The room, once filled with casual chatter and quiet laughter, was now frozen in stunned silence. Maria's fingers moved across the keys with a grace no one expected. The melody was rich, full of emotion, telling a story without words, a story of struggle, resilience, and something even deeper that none of the guests could quite name. Mr. Thornton's smirk faded as he watched, his amusement turning into something else. The guests exchanged glances, unsure whether to be impressed or uncomfortable. How could a maid, someone they never even noticed, play like this? Where had she learned? Maria's mind drifted back to her childhood. Her mother, a housekeeper for another wealthy family, had always told her to work hard, to stay humble. But in the quiet moments of her youth, when no one was watching, she had pressed her small fingers against a piano's ivory keys, mimicking what she had heard from afar. Over the years, she had taught herself in stolen moments, listening, practicing, feeling every note in her soul. Now, as she played in this grand room, filled with people who had never seen her as more than a servant, she poured every hidden dream into the music. But then, just as the melody reached its peak, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Enough." Maria's fingers froze. The last note hung in the air, trembling like a secret on the verge of being exposed. Maria's hands hovered above the keys, her breath unsteady. Across the room, Mr. Thornton stood, his expression unreadable. The command had come from him, but it wasn't just annoyance in his eyes. It was something deeper, something guarded. The guests stirred, a few whispering among themselves. One woman, dressed in an emerald gown, leaned forward. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity rather than mockery. Maria lowered her hands to her lap, unsure how to answer. She wasn't supposed to be the center of attention. She wasn't supposed to be anything more than a shadow in the background. Mr. Thornton cleared his throat, forcing a thin smile. "Quite the surprise," he said, his tone light but forced. "Who would have thought?" He glanced around the room, as if trying to shift the focus. "A maid with hidden talents." The words stung, but Maria stayed silent. She had seen this before, the way people laughed off things they didn't understand, the way they tried to diminish what unsettled them. But not everyone in the room shared his reaction. A man near the fireplace, an older gentleman with silver hair and thoughtful eyes, watched Maria closely. "What's your name, child?" he asked. Maria hesitated before answering. "Maria Castillo, sir." The man nodded slowly. "Maria Castillo," he repeated, as if the name meant something to him. "Tell me, who taught you to play?" A weight settled in Maria's chest. She had taught herself, but that wasn't the full story. There had been someone she had almost forgotten. Before she could answer, Mr. Thornton clapped his hands together. "That's enough," he said, his voice sharper now. "Maria, back to work." Maria stood slowly, but she could feel the energy in the room shifting. Some of the guests weren't ready to let this moment pass, and neither was she. Maria lowered her gaze and stepped away from the piano, her hands still tingling from the music. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the older man watching her intently. His expression wasn't just curiosity, it was recognition. The air in the room was different now. Some guests had leaned in, whispering among themselves. Others sat back, eyes flicking between Maria and Mr. Thornton, sensing an unspoken tension. The maid had done more than just play a song, she had disrupted something. Mr. Thornton reached for his drink, but his hand was stiff, his knuckles white. "Enough distractions," he said with a forced chuckle. "Maria, the guests need refills." Before she could move, the older man spoke again. "Tell me, Mr. Thornton," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why would you hire a maid with such talent and keep her scrubbing floors?" A hush fell over the room. Mr. Thornton set his glass down a little too hard. "She is a maid," he said, his tone clipped. "Her job is not up for debate." The man tilted his head. "Perhaps not. But I recognize that song she played." He looked at Maria. "You didn't just teach yourself, did you?" Maria's heart pounded. Memories flickered, warm hands guiding hers over piano keys, a deep voice humming melodies late into the night. A past she had long buried. Mr. Thornton exhaled sharply. "This is absurd," he muttered. But Maria saw it now, the way his jaw tensed, the way his eyes flickered with something close to fear. The older man leaned forward. "Tell me, Maria," he said gently, "who was your teacher?" Maria swallowed. Her voice felt trapped, but she knew the truth was waiting to be spoken, and when it came out, it would change everything. Maria's breath hitched. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting. The weight of the question pressed against her chest, stirring memories she had tried to forget. But before she could speak, Mr. Thornton abruptly stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "This conversation is over," he said sharply. The older man didn't flinch, afraid of what she might say. A flicker of something, anger, maybe even panic, crossed Mr. Thornton's face, but he masked it quickly. "I don't see why we're entertaining fairy tales," he said with a strained smile. "She's just a maid." Maria clenched her fists. Just a maid. That was how they saw her. That was how she had been forced to see herself. But the music had changed things. She had felt it in the way the guests looked at her now, not as an invisible servant, but as something more. And then she said it. "My father taught me." Silence. The older man inhaled sharply. Mr. Thornton's jaw tightened. The guests sat frozen, confused by the tension thickening in the air. Maria's voice was steadier now. "He was a pianist, a great one." Her eyes locked onto Mr. Thornton's. "And he played in this very house." A sharp gasp came from one of the guests. The older man's expression darkened with realization. But it was Mr. Thornton's reaction that sent a chill down Maria's spine. His hand curled around the back of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "That's enough." His voice was lower now, quieter, but filled with warning. Maria took a shaky breath. She had spent years avoiding this truth, pushing it into the corners of her mind. But the pieces were falling into place now, too quickly to stop. Her father had worked here. He had played for these same people, in this very room. But something had happened, something no one spoke about. And judging by Mr. Thornton's face, it was a secret he intended to keep buried. The room felt colder now, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on everyone. Maria could see it in Mr. Thornton's face, the tension, the fear. He knew exactly what she was talking about, and so did the older man. "You remember, don't you?" The man said quietly, his sharp eyes locked onto Mr. Thornton. Her father was more than just a pianist. He was the best. Maria's pulse pounded. She had spent her whole life believing her father had simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but whispers and unanswered questions. But standing here now, she knew that wasn't the whole story. Mr. Thornton forced a chuckle, but it was hollow. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Maria, you need to stop this nonsense and get back to work." But she didn't move. Neither did anyone else. The guests were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses now, watching something unravel before their eyes. Maria lifted her chin. "Tell me what happened to him." A heavy silence stretched between them. Mr. Thornton's grip on the chair tightened before he finally exhaled, his composure cracking. "He got too ambitious," he said, voice tight. "Forgot his place." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maria's stomach twisted. "He wasn't just a pianist, was he?" The older man pressed. Mr. Thornton's gaze darkened. "No," he admitted. "He was supposed to be more. He had a gift, and people noticed. Too many people." Maria's breath caught. She knew what that meant. Her father had been destined for something greater, an opportunity, a future beyond this house. But someone had taken it away. "You ruined him," she whispered, the realization sinking in. "You kept him here, just like you tried to keep me." Mr. Thornton's face hardened, but he didn't deny it. The room felt like it was holding its breath. And then the older man spoke again. "It's funny," he said slowly. "Talent like that never truly disappears." He turned to Maria. "And neither does justice." For the first time, Maria felt something shift, not just in the room, but in herself. She had spent years believing she was meant to be silent, invisible, but tonight had proven otherwise. She wasn't just a maid. She was a musician, just like her father. And she wasn't going to let history repeat itself.